Hello everyone and welcome to the course and welcome to the first lesson. The first lesson we have over here is what is Linux. So this lesson will be an overview and a presentation on Linux. So what is Linux? Well, Linux is an operating system, just like Windows, Mac, or Unix. And now that we know that Linux is an operating system, let's see what exactly is an operating system. Alright, now an operating system is a mediator between the hardware of the computer and the softwares or apps that you install. The operating system controls the resources that are in the hardware, like for example, the hard disk, the RAM, the processor, and manages them. In other words, if there is a particular app or software and as a user you want to run it, for example, an application like Microsoft Word, and this application requires 128 megabytes of RAM to run on, the operating system will reserve 128 megabytes of the RAM to give it to the application that you are running. Another example, if you are downloading an application and that application is like 5 gigabytes in size, the operating system reserves this 5 gigabytes of size from the hardware for the application that you are downloading. Alright, now let's have a quick overview on Linux history. It is important that you know a bit of the history of Linux before you start. The first version of Linux has been released in September of 1991, and it was made by a student that was in Helsinki University, and the student's name was Linus Torvalds. Linus Torvalds released Linux as an open source, and open source means that anybody can see the code in which the application was written with and can edit it. However, you can't edit any open source application because each open source application has a license agreement. So now before you download any application that is open source and want to use it and start editing in it, you must first see its license agreement. The license agreement will clarify if you can edit in it or if you can only see its code without editing in it. With that being said, open source didn't start with Linus Torvalds. It started with Richard Stallman, and that was in 1983. Richard Stallman was a researcher in the MIT, and he had the ambition that the world will contain free applications that are open source, which gives the users the ability to edit in it and share those applications. Richard Stallman started the GNU project. He wanted to make a free open source operating system. He started the GNU project in 1991. He wanted to make a free open source operating system, but he couldn't reach the proper method or the kernel to make this operating system. In 1991, the GNU project made a lot of tools. One of the most important tools it made was the C programming language compiler, and it's called the GNU C compiler. Now, what is the link between Richard Stallman and his GNU project and Linus Torvalds and Linux? So as said moments ago, Richard Stallman couldn't reach the proper method or the kernel to make this operating system. But Linus Torvalds did reach the proper method to start an open source operating system. In December 1991, their 0.10 version of Linux was released, and to log in there wasn't any user or password, and the operating system Linux 0.10 didn't support any hard disks except for the AT hard disks. As time moved on, Linux started to spread wide and develop across companies. The companies started releasing the kernel of the Linux for people to edit in it and develop it. Linux now is an operating system for many things, including computers, mobile devices, and many more, and it's now trusted and used by many of the large known companies. Alright, now we know that Linux is an open source operating system. That means that any user or organization can edit in it. As time moved on, companies started to edit in Linux and release new versions, and they named the version according to the company's name, like for example, Red Hat Linux or SUSE Linux, Ubuntu Linux, and each name over here is a distribution. So Red Hat, SUSE, Ubuntu, each one of those is a distribution. Each distribution of those has different releases. For example, now there is Red Hat 8, there is Ubuntu 20.04, and so on. In these pictures, those are some of the distributions of Linux. There are more than 50 distributions of Linux. Now, are there any major differences between the distributions? Well, the answer is no. There isn't a big difference between distributions. You may only find slight changes in the commands and slight changes in the locations of the configuration files. There are also maybe differences in the security. For example, there is a distribution called TrustX, which is mainly focusing on the security side of the operating system. As you see over here are some examples of very large companies that use Linux as an operating system, like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. There are a lot of schools, colleges, and universities across Germany, Russia, India, and Pakistan that use Linux. So from that you can see that a lot of the big companies around the world actually use Linux. Yeah, and that's pretty much the overview of Linux. I hope that clarified the answer to what is Linux, and thank you very much for watching. See you in the next lesson.